We are recording starting now. So welcome everyone to the Fort Worth Botanic Garden and Botanical Research Institute of Texas Lunchtime Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Brooke Best. I'm the Director of Research Programs, and I and my research colleagues host this lecture series, which takes place the first Tuesday of each month. Our next talk will be Tuesday, October 4th, when Dr. Ina Vanderbroek, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, will present Caribbean ethnobotanies in New York City. Viewers today will remain muted throughout the lecture, but you can type your questions in the chat anytime, and we'll go over those during the Q&A session at the end. And if you'd like to test out the chat now, of course, you're welcome to tell us where you're watching from, geographically speaking. We'll be recording the lecture for our archives, and pending permission from the speaker, the recording should be available on our YouTube channel in a few weeks. And if needed, links to other resources mentioned during the talk, we can post those on the web event page at our website. So, and of course, if you experience any lags in video or audio quality, I recommend turning your video off and closing other programs or apps. And if that doesn't help, you can always back out, fully exit the Zoom session, and then re-enter using the link on the original page. We have turned off the waiting room, so you won't have to wait to get in. All right, so I'll now turn it over to Mordell, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
All right, thank you, Brooke, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Andrea Weeks to this month's Lunchtime Lecture. Andrea is somebody I know very well and who's very special in my career. She was my dissertation advisor at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, where she is an associate professor and director of the Ted R. Bradley Herbarium. So I was really excited to invite Andrea to come and give this lecture today because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, I've wanted to host her as a seminar speaker here at the Fort Worth Botanic Garden in Britt for a while, since I started my job here in 2018. And also because I learned about this project that she has been working on for the past year or so, exploring the life and scientific legacy of Lena Artz, which she is going to present today, showing you a little bit about this hidden figure of Central Appalachian Shale Barren botany. So when I first heard about this project, I was excited because, well, first of all, my postdoctoral advisor at the Smithsonian Institution, Vicki Funk, spearheaded a project which has now been called the Funk List, which was really targeted toward highlighting the careers of women in science who have been involved in or had their careers based at the Smithsonian Institution. So this has now been referred to as the Funk List, and it has led to an incredible number of new entries, for example, in Wikipedia and many other biographical efforts to highlight the careers of these women in science. And I saw this as a very neat parallel between Andrea's work that she's going to be presenting today and my postdoctoral advisor's work, and something that is very important, of course, which is highlighting many of these hidden figures, these women in science who have been just remarkable, led remarkable careers. And so this was really neat. I also thought this was important for us here in Texas because, well, we have a number of amazing women in science who have built their career in Texas or led a remarkable legacy, not only in botany, but in other careers. One of those is Eula Whitehouse, who is an important figure here for the Botanical Research Institute of Texas and Fort Worth Botanic Garden. She was a bryologist who was a curator of cryptogams at Southern Methodist University Herbarium. And when I started to do a little bit of just shallow research into introducing Andrea's talk today, I realized that Dr. Lena Artz and Eula Whitehouse both shared quite a bit that I was surprised to find. They were born 367 days apart, so almost exactly a year apart. They died just 2 years apart. They were very successful and active collectors. And again, we're very much these hidden figures in botanical science. And so I saw this maybe as an opportunity through the presentation that Andrea is going to share with you today to maybe challenge us here in Texas to develop some similar biographical resources for some of these other hidden figures in the botanical world of Texas. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Andrea Weeks. Really quickly, just a little bit more background information. She completed her Bachelor of Science degree at Cornell University and then came to Texas to complete her dissertation with Dr. Beryl Simpson at the University of Texas, Austin. So Andrea has a number of connections here to Texas, dating back to her dissertation. And of course, I'm excited to hear what she's going to be presenting today about the life and legacy of Lena Artz. So sorry for the long introduction, but welcome, Andrea, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Morgan, for that introduction. Let me share my screen here. Here we go. Can you see it okay, Morgan?
Yes, it looks perfect.
Wonderful. So I'm really thankful for the invitation to speak to you all today about a project that I didn't expect to be doing, but has become a really wonderful endeavor that has occupied my time over the last year or so. So let me start my timer just to get into it, because I want to stick the time and be done by about quarter of. So my talk is about Lena Artz, and this talk is as much about geography as it is about a person. And so since I'm speaking with people from many of you who are in Texas at the moment, and a lot of people do come through Washington, D.C., but I wanted to give an overview of the Central Appalachians. This is a satellite view taken about 250 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, sort of above Southern Virginia, looking northward. And you'll see Washington, D.C. on sort of the upper right-hand corner, and right at the top of the screen, you can barely make out the Finger Lakes of New York. But I love this image because it shows you the Appalachian Mountains, and they are sort of circumscribed by those sort of striated lines on the ground. In Virginia, we call this physiographic province the Ridge and Valley, denoted by its ridges and valleys. Our protagonist, Lena Artz, hails from the Central Appalachians. In particular, a part of the Central Appalachians it's called the Shenandoah Valley, and it is roughly in the area where the label that says Short Mountain Shale Barren, Virginia, is located. She hails from the Massanutten Mountains, as I've come to learn. And so this is where she spent the entirety of her life and her career. And so I'll be speaking a lot about this environment and how it shaped her over her life. So there we go. So my talk today comes in a few parts. I want to talk a little bit about how this project got started, because it's definitely a case of the project finding me. I'm a botanist. I'm not a biographer. I haven't had experience really doing much research in the history of botany before. So this is a new project to me in several ways. And then I want to talk to you about Lena and about her accomplishments and how she started her career, because it's very different than the typical trajectory that we think of when we think of an academic botanist. And in doing so, I'm going to talk to you about some cool botany. So I'm going to be talking to you about the shale barrens, which are a particular ecological community type that is found in the Central Appalachians. And then I want to talk about something a little bit more general, and this is sort of why this work matters. At least I will share with you my perspective on it in terms of how doing this type of biographical research improves our ability to do collections-based research in the 21st century. So this is really what I mean about the legacy of Lena Artz. So to begin, I want to step back about 3 years when Lena Artz was not on my radar. I knew of her name, but I knew nothing else about her. And it began with a different project. And that was in 2019, my university, which is located here on this orange arrow, I direct our university's herbarium, and we adopted the regional collection of the Lord Fairfax Community College, which is located, computer's being slow. There we go. About 60 miles due west in the Ridge Valley physiographic province. And this is a small regional collection. It's about 12,000 sheets. And it was established relatively recently. It was the life's work of Professor Robert Simpson, who began a really deep regional collection in 1974. This region of Virginia, the Northern Virginia Ridge Valley physiographic province, is relatively undercollected in the state. This collection is known to house a number of county level records and state records. And since we've adopted it, many more have come to light. Long story short, the intellectual significance of the collection was such that National Science Foundation awarded us a grant to repair, curate, and digitize this collection and house it at my university. And as part of these funds, I was able to hire a graduate curatorial assistant, Matthew Sheik, to help me do this work. And he is a master's student. And for his thesis project, he's elected to do a floristic checklist. And working with him and some others, we located this park, also in the Northern Virginia Ridge Valley province, that looked promising for a floristic checklist. And it's Shenandoah River State Park, which is in Warren County, right on the edge of the Shenandoah River. And one of the reasons why it was a promising place for him to study, to create a checklist, was because it has a shale barren ecological community. These communities are known for harboring a number of endemic species, rare species that you don't often encounter in Virginia. So there are about 18 endemic species to the Central Appalachian Shale Barrens, and a number of disjuncts. So one of those disjuncts is a species that will be familiar to some of you Texans, Butaloa curtipendula, Sidotes grama. It's really only found in Virginia in these shaly areas. So I knew that this would be a good park for him to learn plants. As part of doing the literature review, we finally get to Lena Artz. And this is because one of the foundational papers discussing these ecological communities and the flora that you may encounter them was published by Lena Artz in 1937. And so her name was not unknown to me, and I will get into why in a next slide. But a couple of things stood out to me about this paper. It was published in 1937, so it's a relatively old paper. She was based in Arlington, Virginia, which is just a stone's throw away from George Mason University, so that piqued my interest. But the thing that really got my attention was that this paper was produced as a consequence of doing a master's thesis at George Washington University. And that was unusual for a woman in the late 1930s to have done. So that was sort of that's an interesting discovery, and I moved on. The name Lena Artz, as I mentioned to you before, was not unknown to me. And that is because of this book, which was published, I don't know if you can see it, by Brit Press in 2012. And that is The Flora of Virginia. And there's a chapter about the history of exploration of Virginia. And Lena has a picture. And so I had read the caption like hundreds of other people and learned that Lena Artz devoted herself to exploring the Massanutten Mountain System in Shenandoah, Warren, and Rockingham counties. That is what I knew of her. And so when I had my initial moment and I went on to Google, like every scholar in the universe, right, to Google this person's name, the only thing I found was a headstone and a picture of a headstone, and it recounted her birth date and her death date. Couldn't find any other information. I put that aside. A little bit later during the salvage project, several of her specimens came to light in the Lord Fairfax Community College Herbarium, and they were from 1965. And a number of questions came to mind. One, who gave these specimens? They were made in 1965, but the LFCC herbarium got started in 1974. For that matter, what was Lena doing between 1937 and 1965? Because I knew already in 1965, she was in her mid-70s, yet she was collecting. And given that I couldn't find any obituary or any memoriam, I wondered what the bibliographic record might say about what she was up to. And what I found surprised me. Over 30 papers spanning 40 years. And this was more than I expected. And it really piqued my interest as to why I didn't know more about her. And then later, and this was something that finally sealed the deal in terms of this suddenly becoming my project, was that I learned that historically, Lord Fairfax Community College Herbarium had been the place that held the notes and records of Lena Artz. Yet, they did not transfer when I adopted the herbarium. And so the question that suddenly was very pertinent was, where are those records right now? Because they're part of the herbarium that should be part of the salvage operation that has been funded by National Science Foundation. And then another question is, why on earth did this institution have her papers? Lena died in 74 or 76, and this herbarium was created in 1974. So it was not like she had a long-term relationship with this institution. And so I think you can probably tell that I wouldn't be giving this talk had I not located those notes, which had actually been set aside in someone's office at the institution for safekeeping. But it was only after a number of inquiries that I did finally locate them. And so at this point, the Lena Artz Biography Project was definitely born. And so what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about who she was, what she accomplished, and why I think it matters, and why we now have more tools at our disposal to do more of this work more efficiently to improve collection space for research. So Lena was definitely a trailblazer, both literally and metaphorically. She hiked the mountains. That was her favorite biome. But she also did a number of things that I think were unique for a person of her background and certainly of her gender in the mid-20th century. She hails from the Shenandoah Valley, and I located her family homestead, which is just due west from the field site of my graduate curatorial assistant, Matthew Sheik. So his site is represented by a dot. Her family farm that she grew up on is located at this star. She was the second to youngest of a family of 6 children. This is her sitting on her mother's lap at probably about the age of 2. A family of modest means, a general farm, a farm by her father, who was a Civil War veteran. She comes from an extended family of educators, as I have come to learn. And that is what she did. She became an elementary school teacher in 1914, and a year later started teaching high school biology. And I have no idea how she became interested in botany or how she got initial training, but I have a sense from what I found in her papers, and that is she took part in what's called the nature study movement. This is a movement popularized by Anna Botsford Comstock through her Nature Notebook series. And these are manuals that were designed not just for school children, K through 12, but also for adults to learn more about the natural world. And in the boxes of papers that I found one of these workbooks that had been completed by Lena regarding how to identify plant families and sort of working your way through floral dissections to sort of learn more about the structure of plants. As a child, she likely benefited from this type of training just as a school child in terms of sort of learning about biology. And I'm certain that she used these same strategies in her own classroom throughout her career based on sort of what I can tell from her papers. In 1917, we find her first record of sort of writing somewhere producing a publication. She wrote a letter into a popular science periodical whose focus was on nature study. And this is called The Guide to Nature, which was a wonderful periodical that was published that trained anyone in how to do natural history observation, like training how to like pin insects, make herbarium specimens, collect mineral specimens. So she was reading these types of things as a young woman. And she wrote in to report some interesting things that piqued her interest, including potato seed balls, which I think that she meant fruit, dodder, and willow cone galls. So she was clearly interested in botany in her mid-20s. And by her early 30s, she was definitely collecting herbarium specimens. And we know this is the earliest known herbarium specimen from 1922. So she was definitely out there. What came next was a leap that I think stands out. And that is at the age of 32, she figured out how to send herself to college. She enrolled in the College of William and Mary sometime between 1923 and 24. This is her in a group photo from a biology club. I have no idea how she afforded to go to college. I don't know how she took a leave of absence from her job, but there she went. And she took plant taxonomy courses, as evidenced by her notebook that I found in her boxes. Here she is seated with close to graduating. She graduated in the summer of 27. She was at college at a very important time during the botanical exploration of Virginia. In 1926, the same year that she was taking plant taxonomy, the Virginia Academy of Sciences created the Flora Committee. And the point of this committee was to energize, encourage research and communication among botanists to do the field work that would ultimately result in a flora of Virginia. So there was a lot of work early on in the late 20s, early 30s, that it didn't go anywhere. And we didn't get a flora of Virginia until 2012. But a lot of the field work was started then. And so I don't know that she was involved in these discussions, but I can't imagine that she wasn't. And based on the next evidence, I suspect that she was very well aware and wanted to contribute to this effort. And that is because between 1927 and 29, she started creating really beautiful herbarium specimens, hundreds of them, actually thousands of them, from the areas where she was teaching or where she lived. And so these are beautiful specimens that include roots. She would often go back to the sites to recollect fruiting material and add that material to the sheets, with the idea, I believe, of creating a county level list that would be useful to the Flora Committee. And then the next leap happened in her life, which I consider trailblazing. And that is in 1930, she left the Shenandoah Valley and she moved to Washington, D.C. She moved in with her sister in an apartment near George Washington University. And she began at a new high school built in Arlington. And it's not clear whether she moved to Washington, D.C. for the job. She would have been very competitive. She had a college education and more than a decade of high school biology teaching experience under her belt. And it was a brand new high school in Northern Virginia. Or whether she moved to Northern Virginia for access to more opportunities for education, I don't know. But she did this when she was 39 years old. She stayed in Arlington for the rest of her teaching career. She stayed at this high school for the rest of her teaching career. She was instrumental in creating something called the Junior Virginia Academy of Sciences, which is an annual meeting for high school students to give presentations about their independent research projects. So it's essentially a science fair that precedes the annual meetings for the Virginia Academy of Sciences. She would return home to the Shenandoah Valley and the Massanutten Mountains on weekends and at holidays. She continued going on forays in Virginia and West Virginia with their academies of sciences for field collecting. But then in 1932, she started her master's degree. And at George Washington University, and her advisor was Dr. Fisk, Robert Fisk Griggs. who was a plant ecologist and also a plant geographer, for lack of a better term. This is a picture of him with his wife in 1947. I think they had, she and Dr. Griggs had a very cordial relationship, a very supportive relationship. And I say that just because this was a saved image, and on the backside, it clearly had been included in a Christmas card more than 10 years after she graduated. It's not clear whether she chose Dr. Griggs as her advisor for a reason. Whether she selected her thesis topic by herself. And her thesis topic was on the flora of the Massanutten Mountain shale barrens. She may have developed it and selected Griggs as her advisor because of his interest in plant geography, or he may have suggested it to her once he figured out that she knew the flora like the back of her hand. And she was also a local in the Massanutten Mountains and could navigate that area very well. Either situation, I think, is likely to have occurred. And this is where I want to tell you a little bit about the shale barren flora, because it is a fascinating component of the Virginia flora. This image here shows you one of the species that is endemic to the Central Appalachian shale barrens. This is Eriogonum alleni, and it's growing out of what looks like pulverized rock. And this is a picture of a shale barren. And so this was an environment that Lena most certainly knew very well as a child. And certainly Robert Griggs knew about it. And that is because the shale barrens of the Central Appalachians have been recognized as a unique ecological community since at least 1911. They're visually very distinctive areas that sort of pop up like islands and forests. This is a picture of one of these shale barrens. And they've been singled out as neat places to study because the herbaceous perennial flora in particular has a disproportionate number of endemic species and rare species, and species that are just rare universally, but also some appearances of disjunct taxa that might be more widespread in the Western US. Lena certainly encountered these near her family's farm. You can see them from a distance because of the way the canopy looks from a distance. As an ecologist, Dr. Griggs certainly was aware of the literature around these areas. A little bit about these funny ecological communities. This image here shows you a fairly well-studied shale barren on the Cowpasture River in southern Virginia. Shale barrens only ever appear on steep shale slopes, and there are two major formations in the Central Appalachians that are differing in age, Ordovician or Devonian. Either way, these shale layers become exposed by erosion, by the action of rivers and streams. And because of their steepness and the way water drains from the areas and the lack of really a solid plant cover, soil development is slowed. There is no organic surface layer on these areas. It's channery only, it's rock fragment. As you might expect, these are really difficult areas for plants to grow. Central Appalachians is generally considered a solid forest, mostly just a closed canopy all the way. But in areas where there are shale barrens, the canopy, if there is any canopy to speak of, is stunted, it's very open, the plants often look water stressed, and there are actually very few woody plant species that can survive in these conditions. The real interesting things occur closer to the ground that are part of the herbaceous perennial flora. Because of the way shale barrens form, they're steep, they're only in these areas where this particular layer of shale is exposed. They're very patchy, but they are numerous. So they tend to be small. And because of sort of the dissected features of the Central Appalachians, there are many of these communities sort of sprinkled like islands from north to south. And so the Central Appalachians generally are considered sort of Southern Virginia into West Virginia. It includes a little bit of Maryland and just a little bit of Southern Pennsylvania is where you're going to find sort of these exposures of shale. The interesting thing about, another interesting thing, there are many interesting things about shale barrens, is that whether or not they form is dependent on slope aspect. And so this is the cardinal direction that the slope faces. And I show you here an image of Shenandoah River State Park, which is that area that my curatorial assistant is creating a checklist of. And you'll note that the brown swath of canopy is the Barren, and it is facing south. On the north brow of this ridge, you see that it's closed canopy. It's not brown. It is the same underlying geology. It's shale on the shady, cool northern slope, and it's shale on the sunny southern slope too, but only on the southern slopes and the south to southwestern facing slopes in the Central Appalachians do you have the occurrences of the conditions that create what we call shale barren communities. And so sort of extending this idea or sort of expanding on this is that they are controlled by heat death, for lack of a better phrase. Southern facing shale slopes, again, no organic matter, pure rock or rock fragment heats up to more than 50 degrees Celsius during the summer months because of solar heat gain. And so many seedlings die in these hot, dry conditions. Many species, although the seed rain is constant coming in from the surrounding communities, only a certain number of species can actually thrive in these conditions. And ecologists subsequent to Lena's generation really have tried to unpack what factors are actually controlling these communities. And they are quite different than the factors that are associated with barrens, which many of us are familiar with serpentine barrens, which are really have very odd characteristics of their mineral nutrient profile. In Central Appalachian shale barrens, it's not soil chemistry that is limiting what grows there. It is temperature, it's water availability, and it's sunlight. The soil chemistry in these areas is pretty much the same as on the other side of the mountain on a northern slope. One of these reasons is that the species that do thrive there have extraordinarily deep root systems, and they have them constitutively. So this was one of the discoveries that Lena made as part of her thesis project. She was really curious as to know why there were some species that seemed to bloom and thrive. And so she took a pickaxe and excavated them. Her thesis is filled with sort of these amusing descriptions of trying to hack her way and follow the root systems of these different endemic species. And included here is an image from her thesis where you see 4 pages of herbarium paper. So each one is about 18 inches long, sort of tiled next to each other to contain the entire specimen of this tiny little herbaceous perennial Eriogonum and the extent of its root system that goes all the way down. And it's this ability of these species to grow a taproot very quickly to, as opposed to investing in leaves, is what gives adapted species the ability to survive these very extreme conditions. She was the first one to figure it out. And later ecologists have sort of expanded to study a little bit more about how these species managed to survive. As part of her thesis work, in addition to her pickaxe work, she also traveled extensively in the Massanutten Mountains and visited as many shale barrens as she could get to. And in doing so, she was creating checklists. And so in doing so, she expanded the known ranges of species into the Massanutten Mountains. And by creating these checklists, she was able to create the information so that species found on Ordovician shales could be compared with lists of species growing on Devonian shales elsewhere. So it allowed comparison between these different shale barren areas. Pictured here are another endemic species. On the left, we have Ariognym, which is endemic. Then on the right-hand side, we have something in the Apiaceae, which is Tinidia montana, also endemic and restricted to Central Appalachian shale barrens. After her thesis work, and she graduated in 1935 at the age of 44, she became sought after by other botanists for her knowledge of the Massanuttons, and her horizons expanded greatly as not just a collaborator, but as a sort of a custom field collector, and also as a field guide. People would come into Virginia and she would guide them through the mountains. She retired in 1943 at the age of 52 on her teacher's pension. And she moved to a cabin somewhere in the range of this circle. And she wrote about half of her known papers at this location. She continued collecting, doing taxonomic work. She expanded her roles. She became vice president of the Southern Appalachian Botanical Society. She started doing a lot of public advocacy around environmental quality and conservation. Because her cabin features so prominently in sort of her work, I wanted to relocate it. And I was able to do so a few weeks ago, and that her cabin still exists. This image that was published in the Flora of Virginia on the right-hand side shows her leaning up against the side of her home, which is essentially now sort of a picture window. And the cellar area has been bricked in, and there's been stonework. But it is still present there in Fort Valley, which is in the Massanuttons. She published her last paper when she was 83, which is, I think, phenomenal. She was incredibly active. I initially thought maybe she was a recluse living in the mountains. She was not. She was incredibly engaged in public advocacy. This looks like a little grocery list is actually her list from 1964 of all the public outreach talks that she did that year in her mid-70s. And she was an active member in the Isaac Walton League, and she spoke a lot about water quality and pesticide regulation, which were big topics in the 60s around DDT. And also National Forest Service management of the Shenandoah Mountains and the Massanutten Mountains. In honor of her work with the Virginia Academy of Science and also on the Flora Committee, the Virginia Academy of Sciences elected her as an honorary member a few months before she died. And after she died, she gave a gift to she gave a fairly sizable monetary gift to the National Park Conservation Association. And the reason we know this, and this investigating her later years helped me answer the questions that I originally started this project with, which was, how did her papers get to the community college? And it was because of the executor of her will, Marlon Krauss, who was also a collaborator and co-author on one of her papers, and what I believe was a really good friend and field companion. He brought her professional papers to the nearest college that he could find, which was Lord Fairfax Community College, and its herbarium, and donated to them. And the curator has since confirmed that it jogged his memory. Oh yes, it was Marlon Krauss who gave me these papers in the mid-70s. So we know what we know about her in large part because of Marlon's actions. And I suspect several of those herbarium specimens that we have came in as part of that donation. But all of this, I want to end with sort of, why is Lena not better known today? And what are her research contributions, and what do they matter for the 21st century? And so I just want to sort of relay some points which sort of bear on why people get lost to history and why people become hidden figures. Lena left no direct descendants. She wasn't associated with any research institution. She didn't have academic children. She didn't train graduate students to remember her. And by the time she died, many of her colleagues had already died as well. And then there were some things that I just ascribed to happenstance. her beautiful collections that she made in the late 1920s were never distributed. She collected them in triplicate. They never left the herbarium in which she deposited them. So her name didn't get out into the herbaria as much as it should have. The journal that she chose for her early papers, it folded in 1939 and remains unindexed today. And her professional papers weren't examined for 40 years after they had been donated to the community college herbarium. It's just happenstance. But then there are some evidence that I think she was excluded. People did not cite her work. This is something that I noticed as I was reading through the Shale Barren papers, that her discoveries were often just sort of mentioned as received wisdom or facts that were just everybody knew about them, but they actually had a basis in someone's work. And so she wasn't as cited as much as I thought she should have been. And certainly people should have known better and done better bibliographic research. And so I was very pleased, or sort of also surprised, to find in her notes that she noticed this too. And so on the backside of one of her papers, offending papers, not her papers, but someone who didn't cite her properly, she wrote what her contributions were. And at some later date in time, she writes, "So give credit, please, for this little bit." So she noticed as well. There's also a paper that is really sort of considered the foundational paper for our understanding of the Shale Barren flora, that specifically said that her observations could be discounted because she used terms differently than other ecologists use them. And so I sort of wonder if this had a chilling effect on whether people were citing her work or not. It's just conjecture. But what we do know is that the specimens that she collected that decades ago remain relevant today. And this is where I want to talk about sort of her legacy to wrap things up. To date, I've been able to discover about 2,000 of her specimens. They are distributed in exactly 20 US and European herbaria. And as a consequence of this project, I've located and digitized about 1,300 of these. And the specimens are useful in all the ways that specimens have been useful. This interesting little spike moss, this Selaginella that she collected in 1949, a mycologist found a brand new species of Ascomycete that specializes on Selaginella hosts. And this species was discovered 16 years after this herbarium specimen was created. We can get a more synthetic or sort of a new view of the relevancy of these specimens to enabling modern day science by using bionomia.net. So if you go to this site, you can actually see specimens as they filter to GBIF and explore the papers that have cited those data sets downloaded from GBIF that include her specimens in work. So for instance, that spike moss specimen that I showed you in the previous slide was again cited in 2019, and it contributed to this paper about the sizes of spores in co-occurring species of Selaginella globally. Her specimens have time value. And as an example, the one taxon that she described new to science, which is the smokehole bergamot, is now considered possibly extirpated in the state of Virginia. And so this gets to where conservation work can rely on the specimens created many decades previously as sort of a starting point for perhaps relocating these species. And to do this, I actually engaged a student, Sabiha, in doing sort of just a case study. Could we do this? Could we use Lena's old specimens to relocate a taxon that is now considered or presumed extirpated in the state of Virginia? And we chose as the case study Astragalus distortus, or the Ozark milkvetch, which has a very odd disjunct distribution in the Central Appalachian Shale Barrens. Hadn't been seen in Virginia for 40 years. Lena wrote a lot about this species. She published a whole note on it about its locations in the Massanutten Mountains. So I thought, well, why don't we just go back and look and see if we can find it? And we did. So we relocated the species in May 2022 of this year in one of the shale barrens that she frequented. And as a direct consequence of this, this species tissue is now being used to understand its conservation genetics and its phylogeography in the country. Future work is going to focus on digitizing her collection notebooks because they have a lot of ecological information that didn't actually make it onto the herbarium labels. And so here I'm holding one of her collection notebooks. And for this particular Gerardia species, the locality is listed correctly, but in her notebook, she mentions something about sort of its prevalence in the community. So I want to get these imaged and linked digitally to her herbarium specimens. Her herbarium specimens, though, take some interpretation. Like many historical collectors, she didn't necessarily use road names. She used the names of property owners on whose land she was collecting, or she referred to landmarks that were personally relevant to her, but maybe not listed in any gazetteer that you might find. And this is something that I discovered in trying to locate the family homestead. This is an 1885 map where I located her home. This is her father, J.P. Artz. And in looking at this map, I realized that the other people's names on this list, I was recognizing. Rittenauer, Funk, these are landowners, even back in 1885. They are still there. They were there during Lena's time, and they are there today if you go back to that area, which I have. And so interpreting her labels requires looking at historical maps to find property owners, to understand where Jack Funk's spring was, for instance, where she collected a lot. I was also able to understand why she listed this particular locality, Stonewall Bend, so frequently in her labels. And that was because that's her family's land. Interpreting using these historical herbarium specimens often requires you to know a lot about an individual. It's very sort of personalized level of research. And then to conclude, I just want to sort of leave sort of with some ideas. And this is that with herbarium digitization, with the access that we now have to millions of herbarium specimens on the Global Biodiversity Informatics or Information Facility, GBIF, we now have access to hundreds of thousands of people's names. And many of them are just completely obscure to us. We have no idea who they are. But I think with the advent of tools like bionomia.net, even tools like ancestry.com, we can now sort of build out a more inclusive record of actually who's doing this work. And in learning more about individuals, we actually learn more about the collections themselves. And I think this is how our one axis along which collections-based research can be advanced by really focusing on people data as much as on plant data. And so I think everyone can help. And I was just wanting to sort of end on a constructive, positive note. And that is there's sort of small and large ways that people can help sort of push forward this inclusive record. 10 seconds. Make sure that if you are a collection manager, your digitized data actually makes it up onto gbif.org. Also, just stay curious about collectors, because I think an artsy mystery may reveal itself that could lead to a number of discoveries that will improve your collection. Make a Wikidata page for an individual if they are deceased, if they do not already have one. This is a way of making data structured and findable in ways that just sort of random text on a web page is not. And you can use Bionomia to flag their specimens to actually sort of do this exploration using structured data. If you know more about the person, make a Wikipedia page for them. Even if it's partial, it's more than what is out there. Finding an image that can be in the public record in the Wikimedia Commons is really a wonderful way to make people more visible. And this is an extra large one. And these are wonderful projects for volunteers and students, is to carry out a person-based curatorial project. Because this has it potentially can greatly improve collections management, retrospective georeferencing, and also taxonomic research. Ancestry.com was a wonderful source of information that I had never really used before, but was essential for sort of piecing together the history of Lena's very atypical career in botanical research. So lastly, I want to end with some acknowledgements, mostly all of you in the audience out there who have used your lunchtime to listen to this talk. It's really wonderful to share more of her history and to sort of make her more visible when for decades she was sort of in the shadows a bit. A number of resources were essential to making this work happen, and almost all of them are free, and they can be explored from the comfort of your own desk. Biodiversity Heritage Library, Google Books, JSTOR, Ancestry.com were wonderful resources. I have to acknowledge a number of people who helped rescue the LFCC collection and who were informants about Lena, including I was able to locate Lena's first cousin, twice removed. She's 80 years old, and she was able to confirm a number of details, as well as confirm the correct way of pronouncing her name, which was Lena. And then also to the owners of Lena's cabin, who I just wrote a cold letter to and said, I'm a random researcher, please, I'm asking about your house. Can you give me some details? And they called me right up and were very forthcoming. And because that has been a really wonderful sort of connector to sort of fill out the components of her life. And then lastly, the Digital Atlas of the Virginia Flora Group, the Natural Heritage Program, and also the Virginia Master Naturalists who helped transcribe many of Lena's specimens. More work will be forthcoming. I hope to have some workshops at conferences next year, hopefully at Botany 2023, to help people learn to do more of this work. So follow me on Twitter, and hopefully I will be able to share some news in a few months in case you want to learn more. So with that, I can answer questions. Thank you again.